Hello, my dear friends. Welcome once again to this quiet corner of the night where stories drift like candlelight and memory breathes softly through the dark. It is the season of Halloween, a time when the world grows still and the veil between then and now feels almost thin enough to touch. Old stories begin to stir again, and the past leans close to whisper its secrets. Wherever you are tonight, beneath warm blankets by the glow of a candle, or driving beneath an autumn sky, I wish you peace, comfort, and the gentle wonder that comes from listening to the echoes of history. Tonight's story is an old one. It drifts from the red fields of Tennessee, where once, they said, a voice moved through the air. A voice they called the Bell Witch. But this is not a tale of terror. It is a story of time, of memory, and of how even silence can remember the shape of a name. So take a slow breath. Let the noise of the world fall away. And together we'll walk softly into the story, where the earth still hums with the past and the night listens back. The Red River winds through northern Tennessee like a line drawn by time itself. Slow, copper-coloured, patient. In 1817, when the fields along its banks were still new to cultivation, a farmer named John Bell and his wife Lucy built their homestead here, near what would become the town of Adams in Robertson County. They had moved west from North Carolina seeking fertile ground and a quieter life. Their days were measured by the ringing of the dinner bell, the scrape of ploughs, and the hum of cicadas rising from the reeds. The Bells were Methodists, steady and hard-working, raising several children. Among them Betsy, the youngest daughter, whose name would one day be folded into the region's most enduring legend. Neighbours described John Bell as fair but firm, a man who believed in the dignity of work and the constancy of faith. In the early years, the family prospered. Their farm grew corn and wheat. Their barn sheltered horses, strong enough to plough the red soil. Evenings brought hymns sung by lamplight and the scent of wood smoke drifting across the valley. That peace did not last. Late in the summer of 1817, John Bell stepped outside at dusk and saw among the rows of ripening corn a creature that seemed wrong to the eye. Part dog, part rabbit, dark and silent. He fired his musket. The creature vanished. When he searched the ground, no track remained. That same night, faint knocking sounded on the wooden walls of the house. At first, the family thought it was the wind against loose boards, but the knocking returned, regular, deliberate, until everyone lay awake listening. Within weeks, the disturbances multiplied. Hands unseen tugged at the bedclothes. Apples rolled across the floor when no one had touched them. Children whispered that they heard a woman's voice calling their names from the hallway. Lucy Bell prayed aloud, asking for calm. The voice answered her prayer with laughter, soft and close. Such things could not easily be spoken of in 1817 Tennessee, a place where scripture was law and the supernatural sat uneasily beside it. Yet the Bells began keeping notes, dates, sounds, hours of the night, because the events defied memory alone. Word travelled along the Red River faster than wagons could carry it. Families from nearby farms came to spend a night in the Bell house, hoping to witness what they called the mystery. Many left before morning. Witnesses swore that the disturbances followed rules of their own. If a Bible was read aloud, pages would tear themselves free. If a hymn was sung, a voice joined in, sometimes echoing, sometimes mocking. Among those who visited was James Johnston, a neighbour of sturdy faith. He spent a night in the Bell home, and later told the church elders that something had struck him in his sleep and spoken his name. It was then that the community began to call the presence the spirit. In early 1818, the voice grew clearer. When asked who it was, it replied, "Kate." The name carried weight in the valley for Kate Batts, a nearby woman known for her sharp temper and dispute over land with John Bell, had long been called eccentric. Though still alive, she became the story's unwilling ghost. Soon people spoke of Kate's witch, and then simply the Bell Witch. The label stuck, as names often do when fear and fascination intertwine. Not all who came felt terror. Some said the voice quoted scripture with accuracy. Others claimed it could repeat sermons given miles away. A few travellers reported being welcomed by polite conversation from no visible source. These accounts, written in local diaries and later compiled by historians, give the legend its peculiarly human tone, half fear, half familiarity. The phenomenon seemed to understand the rhythms of those who lived near the river: work, worship, rest, and rumour. The bells endured. Lucy tended her garden as she always had. Betsy continued her lessons with the local school teacher, Richard Powell, a young man curious enough to record the nightly disturbances in his own hand. Powell's notes, fragments of which survive, mention voices imitating family members, objects displaced, and a presence that addressed him by name. He wrote that the sound came not from air or wall, but from the very space between moments. Even now, readers sense in those words the hush of a teacher trying to describe something beyond his vocabulary. By 1819, visitors from as far as Nashville rode out the Bell property. Newspapers hinted at the tale, but printed few details, wary of ridicule. Still, the legend spread through conversation, a story retold at marketplaces, church steps, and taverns, each telling, adding a new shade. The more people heard, the more the witch seemed to belong to everyone in Tennessee, a communal secret shared under the same humid sky. Some nights were quieter. The river would settle, the cattle would sleep, and John Bell would think the ordeal finished. Then a whisper would rise beside his bed, asking if he still believed he could rest. He grew pale and nervous. Neighbours noticed a tremor in his hands. According to later testimony, the spirit began to single him out, blaming him for an old wrong. Whether that wrong was the land dispute or something unspoken, no one knew. But the attacks increased. Small seizures, numbness, and a voice repeating his name until dawn. Through it all, Lucy Bell remained steadfast. Witnesses said the unseen presence treated her kindly, sometimes singing hymns when she was ill. Such contradictions confused even the most devout. Was this spirit a tormentor or a protector? Folklore rarely offers clear categories. It holds both mercy and mischief in the same breath. The community adapted. Children learned to avoid the Bell property after dark. Preachers debated the meaning of the events from their pulpits, quoting the book of Samuel or the story of Job. Men who prided themselves on reason left the house shaken, uncertain of what they had heard. The local sheriff recorded reports of voices, moving furniture, and unexplained scratches on doors. Each detail added a thread to the growing tapestry of legend. In the autumn of 1820, John Bell's health failed. He was 58, weary, suffering from spells of paralysis. Family members found small vials of liquid near his bedside after one of his seizures. The voice, still calling itself Kate, claimed responsibility. When Bell died that December, neighbours said they heard laughter echo across the valley. It may have been wind moving through bare trees, but to those who had lived the tale, it was proof of the witch's promise fulfilled. The bells buried John in the family plot beside the cornfield. According to local law, the voice sang a mocking hymn during the service and then fell silent. For a time, peace returned to the farm, but even silence carries memory. It does not erase what has been spoken. Within a year, visitors reported hearing faint tapping again, as if someone were marking the pages of a book that could never be closed. Decades later, historians would seek evidence, letters, testimonies, court records. They found fragments enough to suggest that something unusual had happened, though never enough to define it. The story, perhaps, was never meant to be proven. It belonged to the cadence of Tennessee speech, to the pause before evening when crickets start to sing. Folklore, like the river, keeps what it cannot explain. If you stand today near Adams, by the bend of the Red River where the bells once farmed, you will find only open fields and a gentle slope leading down to Bell Witch Cave. The air smells of limestone and damp earth. Tour guides speak quietly, as though words themselves might wake something sleeping. They tell how the legend survived every retelling, through journals, sermons, plays, and late-night campfire stories. Each version changes, yet the center remains. A family, a voice, and the mystery of belief. Perhaps that is why the Bell Witch endures. The story is not about fear, but about how people hold the unknown close enough to give it a name. It is a parable of community, faith, and the restless conversation between what we know and what we cannot. Every whisper of wind through these trees could be memory practicing its lines. Every silence is the pause between verses of a song no one remembers writing. And so the tale begins not in horror, but in attention, in the act of listening to a place until the place begins to speak back. The Red River still moves, slow and brown, beneath the southern sky, carrying with it the echoes of 1817, the bells, and the voice called Kate. Time, like water, does not end. It only finds new ground to touch. The winter that followed John Bell's first encounters was mild by Tennessee measure. Frost rimmed the fence posts only briefly before dawn melted it away, and the air smelled of hickory smoke and wet soil. Yet inside the Bell house, the air felt changed, charged somehow, like the seconds before lightning. The family spoke little of what had begun, though the youngest children often woke crying, certain they'd heard someone whispering just outside their door. Neighbors stopped by with practical sympathy, baskets of meal, offers to help repair loose boards. But when they heard the knocks themselves, when the sound came from within the wood rather than upon it, they grew pale and hurried home. Word spread along the Red River that the Bell place was troubled. Some said the old homestead stood on land once sacred to native peoples. Others blamed an unmarked grave disturbed during planting season. Each explanation seemed to fill a silence that otherwise could not be borne. The bells continued their daily rhythm as best they could. John Bell still rode to town to trade grain, Lucy managed the household, and Betsy attended her lessons. The voice that called itself Kate had not yet taken shape. It remained an echo, half heard, as though the land itself were clearing its throat before speaking plainly. Only after the family knelt for prayer one evening did it begin to murmur words, overlapping their own, a mimicry so perfect that Lucy stopped mid-verse. The voice was female, faint but distinct, and seemed to float between ceiling and floor. Betsy was the first to answer it. She asked softly who it was, expecting a child's trick or a dream. The reply came with startling calm. "I am a friend." From that night forward, the unseen presence spoke more often. It laughed when the children laughed, hummed when Lucy cooked, and recited lines of scripture with precision that unnerved even the preacher. The family began to note the hours when it appeared, as though tracking weather, most often after dusk, when oil lamps flickered low. Accounts from those nights survived through visitors' journals. One wrote that a heavy chair moved on its own across the floor, carving a path through dust as if guided by invisible hands. Another swore he felt a tug at his hair, followed by a whisper repeating his name. Such descriptions reached the ears of travellers and ministers alike, until curiosity outpaced fear. Entire families arrived by wagon to witness the phenomenon, bringing food, staying long into the night. The Bell home became both sanctuary and stage. The spirit seemed to relish the attention. It quoted sermons delivered miles away, mimicked voices of townspeople, and even sang hymns familiar to no one in the room. When asked how it could know such things, it answered, "I am everywhere that thought travels." That line appears in several period writings, though no two versions are identical. Proof, perhaps, that what people remembered most was the idea, not the words. The notion that thought itself might echo through the air seemed both terrifying and beautiful in a place where isolation was part of daily life. John Bell tried reason before resignation. He inspected the attic, the cellar, even the trees outside. Finding nothing, he sought the counsel of Pastor James Gunn, a local minister known for calm judgment. Gunn spent one night in the Bell home. In the morning, he confessed that he too had heard a voice quote the Gospel of Luke beside his bed. He could not explain it, but advised patience, prayer, and kindness. 3 forms of endurance that the Bells already practiced. The disturbances did not fade. Furniture moved without warning, and sometimes small objects vanished only to return days later. Betsy's hair was reportedly pulled by unseen fingers. At times, she felt a hand brush her cheek like the wing of a bird. The family never saw anything, only heard and felt. In those years before photography, when proof depended on witness alone, testimony was the currency of truth, and there were many witnesses. By 1819, even the skeptical came. Major William Porter, a respected veteran, spent a night determined to expose the hoax. He brought a pistol and a knife, claiming he would cut off a piece of whatever dared touch him. Near midnight he cried out, insisting something had grabbed his blanket and thrown it across the room. He swung his knife in the dark, but found only air. The next morning he apologized to Lucy Bell for his disbelief and rode away without a word. His story joined the growing legend. Another voice added to the chorus of confusion. The voice began to grow more conversational, more aware. It spoke of distant events, as though it had witnessed them. It described the Battle of New Orleans, quoting reports that only soldiers might know. Some townsfolk suggested trickery, a ventriloquist hiding near the house. But the sound often came from multiple corners of the room at once. Those who had heard it firsthand said the air itself seemed to vibrate with language. One evening, while Lucy read aloud from the family Bible, the voice recited the verses with her, keeping perfect time, even correcting her when she skipped a word. That incident, recorded in multiple journals, marked a turning point. The Bell Witch was no longer just noise or mischief, but an intelligence woven into the daily life of the household. It was both participant and observer, woven into prayers, meals, and chores. Through it all, the Bells remained curiously composed. Lucy insisted that the family continue attending church. Betsy practiced her penmanship and music. John Bell worked the land. To live under scrutiny was its own burden. But to live under the gaze of something unseen required a discipline born of faith. They spoke less of fear and more of endurance, how to carry on without letting wonder become dread. Folklorists later noted how this stage of the haunting mirrored rural storytelling. Traditions. In southern folktales, the supernatural rarely arrives to terrify. It arrives to teach patience, humility, or remembrance. The Bell Witch, in her early months, seemed almost pastoral, a reminder that even quiet lives can draw the attention of mystery. Outside, the seasons turned. The Red River flooded its banks that spring, leaving layers of new silt across the Bell fields. Neighbours helped rebuild fences. Children played near the water, throwing stones that disappeared in the current. Amid the laughter, a faint echo sometimes answered from the opposite bank, as if the valley itself were learning to speak. The town of Adams, still small and scattered, began to take pride in its notoriety. Travellers brought coin, and local taverns repeated the latest tales. Preachers wove moral lessons around the story, warning congregations against pride or deceit. Yet the bells themselves accepted no payment, refused to sensationalize what was happening. To them, the voice was not performance, it was part of their private trial. Still, Betsy's teacher, Richard Powell, could not help but see in the events a kind of poetry. In his notes discovered decades later, he wrote, "The voice in the bell house behaves as a mirror of conscience. It repeats, remembers, and rebukes, but it never invents." He compared it to the echo of the Red River cliffs, where sound returns softer but unmistakable. Perhaps, he mused, the witch was not a witch at all, but the valley itself remembering what it heard. Such thoughts would find no place in sermons or science, but they endure because they are gentle, because they leave space for wonder without demanding belief. Even now, historians can verify the Bell's existence, their property deeds, the testimony of neighbours, and John Bell's declining health. What cannot be proven is the voice itself. And yet, absence of proof has never silenced a story that chooses to live through retelling. On quiet nights in modern Adams, guides say that if one listens near the old foundations, one might still hear faint knocking, like someone rapping politely on history's door. The sound is rarely loud, just enough to make a listener pause and consider the weight of the past. That pause, that breath between knowing and not knowing, is perhaps the truest form of haunting. The Bell Witch's first whispers were not threats, but invitations, calls to notice what we usually ignore. The creak of timber, the shift of wind, the soft logic of fear and faith intertwined. When the bells learned to listen, rather than resist, the household did not become peaceful, but it did become attentive. And in that attention lay a kind of grace. For every haunting, however strange, begins with someone who chooses to listen longer than comfort allows. By the summer of 1819, the voice in the Bell home no longer needed to whisper. It spoke with the volume and poise of a guest unafraid to claim a seat at the table. The family, exhausted by months of questions without answers, began to treat it as a presence rather than a phantom. They addressed it by name, Kate. The word hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, ordinary, almost tender, yet carrying a chill that no warmth could dispel. Neighbours soon heard that Kate could talk freely, and their curiosity outgrew their fear. Visitors arrived nightly. Men who had once called the bells liars now brought wives and children to listen. They gathered in the main room, lamps flickering, waiting for the voice to begin. Some evenings it quoted scripture. Other nights it recited local gossip. mocking the speaker's accent with unsettling accuracy. On rare occasions, it sang Old English ballads or fragments of hymns known to no one present. The witnesses wrote of its clarity. The sound did not echo from a corner, but seemed to form in the centre of the room, suspended in the air like a breath that never ended. Those who heard it often felt the hair rise on their arms, not from fear, but from the sheer strangeness of hearing speech with no source. When questioned, the voice claimed many things: that it was the spirit of Kate Batts, that it was an old soul seeking rest, that it was a messenger. Each night its tone changed, as though memory itself were trying on different stories, searching for one that fit. Betsy Bell, still a child, but growing fast, became its favourite and its victim. The voice teased her, scolded her, sometimes praised her for her manners and music. But when she laughed too freely, it turned sharp, warning her of a fate she could not yet understand. Once, when she announced her engagement to Richard Powell, the teacher, the voice rose in fury, shaking the rafters. It predicted misery should they marry. That prediction haunted Betsy's heart more deeply than any knock on the wall. The rest of the family endured with patience. Lucy Bell, guided by faith, treated the entity as a wayward soul rather than an enemy. She would ask Kate to sing hymns, and sometimes joined in, her voice trembling but sincere. When Lucy fell ill, the unseen visitor offered comfort, promising to leave her unharmed. Even skeptical neighbours admitted that the disturbances seemed to spare her room. The contradictions, malice towards some, gentleness toward others, only deepened the mystery. Historians have since compared this stage of the haunting to a community drama, a living allegory where each participant plays a role reflecting their fears and hopes. The bells stood for steadfast belief, the neighbours for curiosity, and Kate, whatever she was, for the restless power of the unknown in a young nation still finding its myths. America in 1819 was a patchwork of frontiers, revivals, and whispered superstition. The Bell Witch, half sermon and half folk tale, fit perfectly within that space. At times, Kate displayed knowledge beyond human reach. When a traveller from North Carolina visited, she greeted him by name, reciting details of his journey and the weather he had left behind. He fled before dawn, unable to accept what he'd heard. In another account, she quoted a sermon delivered in Nashville that same week, word for word. No one could explain how the Bells, who seldom left Robertson County, might have learned it. Such incidents gave the story a gravity that superstition alone could not explain. Despite these marvels, the household continued to function. John Bell still tended his crops. Lucy preserved fruit. The children studied. The difference lay in how they spoke of ordinary things. Every word felt shared, overheard, as though the walls themselves might answer. Conversation became cautious, even reverent. They were living, as one later writer said, inside a sermon being preached by something invisible. The voice was not always cruel. It often discussed faith, debating scripture with ministers who visited. Once, when Pastor Gunn asked what it desired, it replied simply, "Rest." The word lingered in the room until silence followed it, but rest never came. Each time peace seemed possible, a new disturbance began. Faint laughter, footsteps across the roof, the scent of jasmine in a season when no flowers bloomed. By the end of that summer, the Bells' home had become a destination for the curious. Wagons lined the road, travellers brought candles, hoping to catch a glimpse of what could not be seen. The phenomenon blurred the line between spectacle and sacrament. Some left frightened, others inspired. For the bells, it was no longer entertainment, but endurance. John Bell's health began to falter. The strain of sleepless nights and the constant tension etched itself into his features. He grew slower in speech, less steady in gait. The voice sometimes taunted him, calling him Old Jack, promising his downfall. When neighbours offered to move him elsewhere, he refused. "If it follows me," he said, "then I will know it is no trick of place." The events of those months reached beyond Robertson County. Travellers carried the tale downriver to Nashville, where it found its way into tavern talk and church gossip. Letters survive describing a talking spirit that confounded both science and scripture. Each retelling changed the shape slightly, like light bending through mist, but the core remained. The bells, the voice, and the question of belief. Folklore scholars note that such stories served a communal need in frontier societies. They created boundaries of wonder, safe places for fear to live. The Bell Witch was, in that sense, a shared dream. Everyone feared her, yet everyone cherished the telling. The family's ordeal gave the community a language for uncertainty, a way to speak of the invisible without shame. Evenings grew shorter, and the land turned gold with autumn. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the Red River reflected skies of rust and amber. The voice spoke less often now, but when it did, its tone deepened. Lower, slower, like an old woman remembering rather than performing. Sometimes it would call for silence and then whisper a prayer. At other times, it would hum softly until the house itself seemed to vibrate with the note. Betsy, older now and more thoughtful, began to sense a strange compassion within the voice's restlessness. It frightened her still, but she no longer hated it. When she prayed not for escape, but for understanding. Perhaps that shift, the movement from fear to empathy, is what changed the story's rhythm. From this point on, the haunting became more personal, more inward. Visitors continued to come. One, a travelling Methodist preacher named James Ingram, later wrote a full account of his stay. He described the voice as clear as the ring of a bell, filled with wit and reason. He noted that the bells offered no theatrical gesture, no attempt to convince him. The phenomena came of their own accord, calm and deliberate. He concluded that the spirit was a power of knowing, neither wholly dark nor wholly divine. His journal, preserved in a Nashville collection, remains one of the clearest windows into the legend's living moment. Ingram's writing also hints at the story's quiet beauty. Between his descriptions of moving chairs and whispered songs, he includes long pauses to note the way moonlight touched the Bell fields, the scent of drying corn, the hum of crickets beyond the walls. These details matter. They remind us that the haunting was never separate from its landscape. It was the landscape speaking. The Red River Valley, with its soft hills and thin veil of mist, offered the perfect stage for something unseen to find a voice. By late autumn, even the skeptics admitted there was something extraordinary in Adams. Not necessarily supernatural, but undeniably human. A shared surrender to mystery. Kate spoke less frequently, but more meaningfully, choosing words that lingered long after she fell silent. Once, when asked why she tormented John Bell, she answered, "Because I can." Then, after a pause, "Because he must listen." The line feels cruel until one considers its echo. In every haunting, the listener is transformed. To be forced to listen, to attend to what hides beneath habit, is to awaken. The Bell Witch, in her strange and patient way, was teaching attention. The bells could no longer take the ordinary for granted. Each creak, each sigh, each silence held weight. Such is the nature of folklore. It begins with fear and matures into reflection. The Bell Witch was never truly a monster. She was a mirror held up to a family, a community, and a nation, learning how to live with the unseen. Outside, the Red River flowed on, indifferent yet eternal. Crows passed overhead, their wings cutting brief. Shadows across the fields. The house stood quietly, waiting for the next word. By the turn of 1820, the Bell Witch was no longer merely a household mystery. It had become the most whispered story in Middle Tennessee. From the mills along the Red River to the churchyards of Springfield, people spoke of the talking spirit of the bells. In a time when printed news travelled slowly and word of mouth ruled the frontier, the tale spread like wind over wheat. Each retelling added colour, a floating voice, a handprint in the ash, a curse on the patriarch. It was no longer just the bell's burden, it was the valley's. The road to the Bell Farm grew busier. Wagons rattled over the red clay, carrying preachers, skeptics, and wanderers alike. Some came seeking salvation, others sought spectacle. At dusk, their lamps would glow like small stars, scattered across the fields. The bells, weary but hospitable, opened their door to nearly everyone. To refuse would have been unchristian, and besides, perhaps one more witness might bring understanding. Among those who came was Major John Johnston, a relative of the family known for his courage and reason. He visited one evening, determined to uncover a trick. He asked questions the way a soldier might interrogate an unseen foe. "Where do you come from? Why are you here?" The voice replied from thin air, calm and measured. "I am everywhere, and I have been here always." When Johnston pressed further, asking about a family matter known only to the bells and himself, the voice answered with perfect detail. His skepticism broke. He left the house pale, saying, "Whatever it is, it knows me better than I know myself." In town, the story deepened. Merchants repeated Johnston's testimony. The local blacksmith swore the witch had spoken to him while he repaired a horseshoe, describing the colour of the sky over his home 2 counties away. Even farmers who dismissed the tale found themselves listening at night for sounds that were not there. The haunting had become a mirror in which everyone saw something different: guilt, curiosity, wonder. Ministers arrived from as far as Kentucky to pray within the Bell home. They came armed with faith and Bibles worn thin from use. Some left confident they had banished the spirit. Others admitted that the voice simply grew quiet out of politeness, then resumed after they were gone. It seemed to respect sincerity but ignore command. When one preacher accused it of being demonic, the voice replied gently, "Would you know the difference if I were?" That answer, half challenge, half sermon, passed quickly through the countryside. It turned the witch from a mere haunting into a kind of philosopher of the unseen. Her words echoed in pulpits and taverns alike. Each listener claimed to understand them differently. Some heard temptation, others heard wisdom. The ambiguity made the story immortal. In those years, Tennessee was a place of contradictions. Revival meetings by day, superstition by night, education rising, but mystery still ruling the dark. The Bell Witch occupied the space between, a bridge from the rationale to the unknown. Newspapers, cautious yet intrigued, began to mention the Bell phenomenon. The Nashville Clarion hinted at a voice without body troubling the good people of Robertson County. For the first time, the witch had entered print. The bells themselves avoided reading such accounts. For them, the haunting was not news. It was exhaustion. Nights blurred into one another. John Bell's health worsened. His limbs stiffened. His voice faltered. The unseen visitor, once playful, became more pointed in its mockery. It called him Old Jack Bell and told him his time was short. Still, when Lucy prayed, it prayed with her. The contradictions were endless. Visitors began to note the differences in tone. Some evenings were almost peaceful, the voice telling stories, laughing softly, even quoting poetry. On others, the air felt heavy, and the words came sharp as thorns. A historian writing later compared the haunting to a storm that circles the same valley again and again, sometimes raining, sometimes only darkening the sky. The Bells' neighbours began to debate what the haunting meant for the community. Was it punishment for sin? A sign from God? A lesson in humility? People attended church in greater numbers. Sermons turned toward themes of confession and repentance. The Bell Witch, without intending to, had become a kind of preacher, stirring faith through fear. Among the curious was General Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States. According to local accounts, Jackson heard of the witch while passing through Tennessee during his military career. Skeptical but intrigued, he brought a small party to Adams, determined to test the tale. As their wagon approached the Bell property, the wheels locked without reason. The horses refused to move. Jackson reportedly exclaimed, "By the eternal, boys, it's the witch!" Moments later, a woman's voice, unseen, told him he could proceed. The wheels turned freely. That night, Jackson's men stayed at the Bell home. They heard laughter, footsteps, and whispered warnings. One soldier claimed an invisible hand struck him, leaving a welt. Jackson, a man of reason and pride, left before sunrise. He is said to have declared, "I would rather fight the British again than spend another night with the Bell Witch." Whether he truly said those words, history cannot prove. But they have been told and retold until they feel truer than any record could. After Jackson's visit, the legend could no longer be confined to one family. It became a regional myth, a thread woven into Tennessee's identity. The Bell Farm turned into a landmark of the strange, visited by travelers who came not for fear, but for wonder. They stood beneath the same oak trees and felt the same soft wind, hoping to hear what the bells had heard. Sometimes they claimed success, but more often they heard only silence. Silence, though, can be a teacher. It reminds us that not all mysteries speak loudly. The Bells had learned that lesson too well. Betsy, once playful, grew thoughtful, her laughter rare. She found herself torn between affection for her teacher, Richard Powell, and the voice's dark warnings. The spirit's words followed her even at school. When she wrote her lessons, her pen sometimes moved as if guided by another hand. Powell, both scholar and secret romantic, watched with concern. His notes from that time speak of a contest between innocence and something vast, unseen. Outside, the world moved on. Cotton prices rose, the nation expanded westward, and Tennessee began to modernize. Yet in Adams, time seemed to pause. The Bells lived as though suspended between centuries, caught in a dialogue that would not end. Every visitor who entered their home became part of the conversation, another line in a story that told itself. What makes the Bell Witch so enduring is not the noise or the fear, but the humanity within it. The voice did not speak of hellfire or vengeance alone. It spoke of everyday things: harvests, neighbours, love, loss. It reminded people that even the smallest life is worthy of being remembered. Perhaps that was its purpose all along, to make a quiet corner of Tennessee unforgettable. By the end of 1820, winter had returned. The river froze at its edges, and the fields lay bare. The Bell home, once lively with visitors, grew still. John Bell's strength waned further. Betsy prayed by his bedside, while Lucy kept vigil with her Bible. The voice came less often now, as if waiting for something. Those who remember that winter say the house felt suspended between worlds, half farmstead, half chapel. It was in that stillness that the next chapter began, a death, a silence, and the echo that would never end. Winter of 1820 settled upon the Red River Valley with a quiet that felt deeper than cold. Frost collected on fence rails and window panes, and the air held that still, silvery hush that comes before snow. Inside the Bell home, the hearth burned low, but the warmth could not chase away what lingered in the shadows. John Bell, the patriarch, sat by the fire, his hands trembling as he tried to lace his boots. His once strong voice, the voice that had led prayers and settled disputes, had grown faint, each word thinner than the last. The family watched, helpless as the illness advanced. His limbs stiffened, his mouth twisted slightly, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. Physicians came and went, suggesting treatments of the time, mercury tinctures, bleeding, rest, yet none brought relief. Some whispered of stroke, others of curse. In the valley, the two explanations carried equal weight. The voice returned often that winter, not loud, but clear, and always directed at John Bell. It called him Old Jack, sometimes taunting, sometimes tender. "You will not recover," it said one evening, from somewhere near the chimney. "Your time draws near." The family froze, yet Lucy, ever steadfast, replied, "The Lord alone decides that." The voice fell silent, as if considering her faith, then whispered, "We shall see." Outside, the fields lay fallow, the corn long harvested. The Red River glided through the valley, dark and slow beneath thin ice. Neighbors came to check on the Bells, bringing quilts and prayers. Each visitor carried a different belief about what was happening. Some thought John Bell was under divine trial. Others claimed his illness was the witches' doing. But all agreed on one thing. There was a change in the air around the Bell farm. Something heavy, something watchful. Lucy Bell's devotion became legend in itself. She sat by her husband's side every night, her Bible open, her lips moving in prayer even as she dozed. The voice never mocked her. In fact, it often joined softly, reciting verses as if from memory. Once, when Lucy recited the 23rd Psalm, the Spirit echoed her words perfectly, line by line, in a tone so gentle it made Betsy weep. No one knew if it was kindness or cruelty, or something between. As John weakened, Betsy found herself haunted not only by the voice, but by the future it seemed to promise. She had accepted a courtship from her teacher, Richard Powell, but the Spirit opposed it fiercely. "Do not marry him," it warned, again and again. "He is not what he seems." Whether out of fear or intuition, Betsy began to hesitate. She told her mother that when she dreamed of Powell, the voice always lingered close, humming in disapproval, as if trying to rewrite the story before it began. One night in early December, John Bell attempted to take his medicine, a small bottle of liquid prescribed by his physician. But when Lucy went to fetch it from the cupboard, she found the vial replaced with a strange dark bottle filled with a smoky, foul-smelling liquid she did not recognize. The voice broke the silence. "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, and he'll never get up again." The family panicked. The doctor was called. He examined the mysterious bottle, touched it to his lips, and recoiled. "It is poison," he said simply, but no one could explain how it had arrived. The voice offered no more words, only a soft, satisfied laugh that echoed through the rafters like wind through reeds. On the morning of December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. His face was calm, his hands folded across his chest as if in prayer. The air in the room felt still, too still, that kind of silence that belongs not to sleep but to something beyond it. Lucy wept quietly, and Betsy held her hand. As the news spread through the valley, people spoke not only of grief but of awe. A man had died, and a spirit had claimed responsibility. That evening, during the vigil, the family gathered with friends and neighbours. Candles flickered. The minister prayed, and then, clear as ever, came the voice. "He is gone, at last." The room froze. "I fixed him," it continued. "I gave him peace." Some screamed, others prayed louder. Lucy, pale but unbroken, whispered, "Lord, forgive her, whoever she is." The voice replied, soft now, almost kindly, "Rest easy, dear Lucy. You are good." The funeral drew half the county. Men rode in from miles away to see if the Bell Witch would appear. The churchyard overflowed with mourners and spectators alike. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, a faint sound rose over the hymns, laughter. Not cruel, not joyous, but strange and distant, like someone laughing through a dream. No one could find its source. It drifted on the wind, carried across the frozen fields. After the burial, life at the Bell home changed. The voice still visited, but less often, as if satisfied. Lucy continued her prayers, and the spirit seemed to respect her devotion. It would sing with her at times, a thin echo of an old hymn, carried on air that smelled of cedar and cold ash. Betsy, however, could not escape its warnings. It still spoke of her engagement, urging her to end it. When she finally did, calling off the marriage to Powell, the house grew silent for the first time in years. The silence was not absence, it was a new presence, calm and weighty. The Bells described it as the feeling after a storm has passed, trees still dripping with rain, sky clearing, the land breathing again. The family began to heal, though John's chair by the hearth remained empty, untouched. In the spring of 1821, the voice spoke one final time. It came to Lucy while she prepared supper. "I'm going away," it said. "I will return in 7 years." She did not ask where it would go or why. She only nodded and replied, "May you find peace." The air stirred once, like a sigh, and then there was nothing. For 7 years the Bells lived quietly. The fields returned to life. The river ran clear again. Betsy married another man and moved away. Lucy aged gracefully, her faith undimmed. When the appointed time came, 1828, some said the voice did return, briefly, to speak with one of John's sons. But it was not angry then. It spoke of distant lands, of time passing, and of God's will. After that, it was gone for good. The story of the Bell Witch might have ended there, but stories, like rivers, never stop entirely. They only change course. In the decades that followed, travellers, writers, and scholars came searching for proof. Some found echoes, others only dust. The Bell farm fell into quiet ruin, the timbers reclaimed by vine and soil. Yet even as nature erased the outlines of the house, the memory endured, carried in the songs and whispers of the South. What remains today is not fear, but fascination. People speak of the Bell Witch not as a monster, but as a mystery that once made a small Tennessee valley feel vast and alive. A tale that blurred the line between the living and the departed, between guilt and grace. Perhaps that is the truest haunting of all, the kind that lingers not in the air, but in memory itself, gentle and unending. The winter that followed John Bell's death was unlike any the valley had seen. The snow fell softly that year, blanketing the land in a quiet too deep for words. The Bell home, once filled with prayers, visitors, and the faint echo of another voice, stood still. Only the ticking of a clock and the whisper of the hearth filled the air. For the first time in years, there were no footsteps on the stairs at night, no knocks against the walls, no laughter rising from nowhere. Just silence. Lucy Bell moved through her days like someone walking through memory. She prepared meals for a smaller table, folded blankets untouched by the weight of her husband's hands, and listened, not for voices, but for peace. She had prayed for this quiet, yet when it came, it felt almost too vast, like a cathedral emptied of its congregation. Neighbours continued to visit, bringing kindness, but also curiosity. They spoke in hushed tones of the witch who killed old Jack Bell. Some came hoping to witness what remained, others to assure themselves it was truly over. Lucy met them with the calm grace that had always defined her. She offered tea, spoke little of the past, and when asked about the haunting, she would say only, "It was something we were meant to endure." Betsy, now nearing womanhood, walked the fields alone. She often stopped near her father's grave, her fingers brushing the frost from his name. The air there seemed stiller than anywhere else, as if even the wind held its breath. Sometimes she thought she heard faint words, half memory, half dream, carried through the trees. Not the mocking tone she remembered, but something quieter, a sigh perhaps, or the echo of forgiveness. In town, the story of the Bell Witch had already begun to take root beyond the Bell's control. Travellers told of an invisible voice that could recite scripture and foretell death. Ministers warned from their pulpits that faith alone could guard against unseen evils. And local storytellers began to shape the events into legend, smoothing rough edges, adding rhythm and meaning where real life had offered only confusion. Yet even as rumour grew, the Bells themselves withdrew. Lucy tended to her home, her children, and her fields. The younger Bells spoke of moving west, following the tide of settlers pushing beyond Tennessee. But Lucy refused to leave. She said the land had been sanctified by both suffering and grace, and she could not abandon it. If a spirit found its voice here, she told a neighbour once, then perhaps others will find their peace. That spring, the valley bloomed with rare beauty. Wildflowers carpeted the hills, and the Red River shimmered gold under the sun. To some, it felt like a sign that whatever force had haunted the Bells was finally gone. But the quiet still had its own weight, like a presence without form. On still evenings, when the sky turned copper and the cicadas began to hum, the Bells sometimes felt they were being watched, not in malice, but in memory. Betsy's former suitor, Richard Powell, married another woman and left for a teaching post in another county. Yet whispers followed him too. Some said he had studied strange philosophies, that he believed thought itself could shape the world. Others claimed he had kept notes on the haunting, convinced it was a manifestation of collective fear. His writings, if they ever existed, were never found. Still, in some tellings, he becomes part of the legend himself, a man touched by the unseen, forever changed by it. The community, having no clear answers, found solace in storytelling. The Bell Witch became their way of speaking about what cannot be named. The weight of guilt, the mystery of faith, the fragility of reason. In a land so new, where life and death met often in the same field, it felt natural to give shape to the invisible. The tale was not just about punishment, but about remembrance, about how even a whisper can outlive a lifetime. Years passed. The Bell children married, moved, built new homes. Lucy aged slowly, her hair turning white, her eyes clear as ever. On summer evenings, she would sit on the porch, reading scripture aloud, her voice soft against the chorus of crickets. Sometimes she would pause mid-verse, listening. "Did you hear that?" she'd ask the wind. Most nights there was nothing, but now and then, faint as a breeze through the wheat, came a low hum, something between a song and a sigh. In 1828, true to the promise made 7 years before, the voice returned. It spoke not to Lucy, but to her son, John Bell Jr. He was sitting alone one night when he heard it. Gentle, distant, almost human. "I am not gone," it said, "only waiting. There are others who will speak of me." The voice lingered for a few moments, then faded into the sound of the river outside. When he told his mother the next morning, Lucy simply nodded. "Then let them speak," she said. "We have nothing more to fear." After that, the spirit was never heard again, at least not in any way the Bells could name. But its memory had taken root in the land. Travellers passing through the valley would later claim to hear whispers near the old homestead, or laughter echoing from the trees. Farmers said their horses sometimes startled at invisible shapes along the riverbank, and in time, people began to visit not from fear, but from reverence, as though the Bell Witch were less a ghost than a guardian of the place, a reminder that the world is wider than it seems. By mid-century, the Bell home had decayed into ruin. The timbers collapsed, the roof caved in. Children played among the stones, daring one another to call the witch's name. Few ever stayed long after sunset. The earth had reclaimed what was once a house of faith and fear, leaving behind only the outline of a story. And so, the Bell Witch passed from experience into folklore, from life into language. What began as a family suffering became a region's song, a tale carried on campfires and front porches, in classrooms and quiet whispers. Each retelling softened its edges, turned horror into lesson, pain into memory. In the cool of an evening, if you walk along the Red River and listen closely, you might hear the rush of water over stone, the creak of old trees, the hum of cicadas, nothing more. Yet somewhere within those sounds, beneath the rhythm of the living world, lingers a voice that once spoke in a farmhouse 2 centuries ago, a voice that wanted to be known, then to be forgotten, and finally to be remembered again. That is how some stories live forever, not by shouting, but by fading, slowly, gently, into the silence that holds us all. By the middle of the 1830s, the Bell family's land looked much as it had before the gold of rumour touched it. The wheat returned, steady and golden in the wind. The Red River flowed clear, cutting its slow, unbroken path through the limestone banks. And over the old Bell property, nature moved quietly, repairing what fear had once fractured. The farmhouse, though aging, still stood. Lucy kept it tidy, refusing to let it rot into myth while she still drew breath. She said it was her duty, to memory, to her children, and to God. Time had a way of softening the edges of tragedy. The neighbours no longer crossed themselves when passing the Bell place. They waved from their wagons. Some even came to borrow seed or share the news of a birth. But in every heart lingered the faint echo of the story. It had become a kind of shared inheritance, spoken not with dread, but with the quiet awe reserved for things that will never be fully understood. Lucy Bell lived well into her 80s, strong in her faith, until her final day. When she passed, her sons buried her beside John, under the same oak that had shaded their wedding long ago. Those who attended said the air that day was still and soft, and that the cicadas fell silent for the length of the sermon. Whether by coincidence or remembrance, no one could tell, but all agreed it felt like a peace earned. After Lucy's passing, the last thread between the living bells and their haunting loosened. The property changed hands several times. Some owners stayed, others left after claiming to hear whispers or light footsteps in the attic. But for most, it was simply a farm, land to work, soil to till. The ghost, if it remained, had learned to sleep beneath the rhythm of everyday life. By the late 19th century, the Bell Witch story was already legend. Writers traveling through Tennessee began to record it alongside other tales of the American frontier. The Cherokee mounds, the haunted hollows, the ghost lights of the South. Each retelling shaped it anew. In one version, the witch was a wronged woman seeking justice. In another, a restless soul teaching the bells humility. None agreed on the truth, yet all agreed on one thing. The voice had been real. In 1894, a book titled An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch was published by M.V. Ingram, a newspaperman from Clarksville. He claimed to have gathered his material from descendants, diaries, and local testimony. His version gave the legend permanence, turning oral memory into printed history. Readers across the country learned of John Bell's torment, of Betsy's warnings, of the laughter at the funeral. What had once been whispered by firelight was now bound in paper and ink. With Ingram's book, the Bell Witch stepped out of the valley and into the imagination of a nation. Skeptics saw in it a case of hysteria, or trickery, or group belief. Spiritualists saw proof that the veil between worlds was thinner than reason allowed. And, in Tennessee, the story became something else altogether. A reminder of its own uniqueness. A southern folklore rooted not in violence, but in voice. Visitors began to arrive again. By the early 20th century, the site had become a quiet pilgrimage for the curious. Some came with cameras, others with prayer. They walked the rolling fields where the bells once lived, listening for the faint rustle of the past. When the wind swept through the trees, some said they heard laughter, light, distant, almost human. Others heard nothing and left content with silence. In the nearby town of Adams, people spoke of the haunting as one might speak of weather, casually, familiarly, as part of life. The Bell Witch was not feared, only respected. School children learned her story before they learned their state's history. On autumn nights, they would tell it again on porches and in barns, their voices low, as if afraid to wake something still dreaming in the soil. The landscape itself became part of the legend. Just downriver from the old Bell property lies a limestone cave, cool and dark, its entrance half hidden by vines. Locals called it the Bell Witch Cave. Some said the spirit retreated there after leaving the farmhouse. Others believed it was her home all along. Explorers claimed to hear whispers deep inside or see lights that moved without flame. But like the voice itself, the truth remained unseen. Folklorists visiting in the 1930s wrote that the cave had a peculiar stillness. No matter how loud one spoke, the echo returned faint, as if swallowed by the stone. Some believed the witch still listened from within, not to torment, but to remember. The cave became a shrine of sorts, a threshold between fact and story, between faith and imagination. As the years turned to decades, the Bell Witch transformed again, from haunting into heritage. Festivals were held, plays performed, and radio dramatizations broadcast across the South. Listeners tuned in not for fear, but for the rhythm of a story that had survived nearly a century of retelling. It was no longer about curses or spirits. It was about a family, a place, and the strange persistence of the unseen in a world that insists on evidence. And yet, beneath all the retellings, something of the original silence remained. The people of Adams still say that on certain nights, when the air is heavy and the river slow, you can feel the past pressing gently against the present. Not a ghost exactly, but an atmosphere, a reminder that every story ever told leaves a residue, faint as breath on glass. A scholar once wrote that legends are like echoes. Each generation calls into the dark and listens for what comes back. The Bell Witch, perhaps more than any other, has taught the South to listen, to its past, to its land, to the thin hush that connects the living to those long gone. So the valley endures. The fields still wave under the Tennessee sun. The river still carries its slow music. And in the evenings when the wind turns warm, the silence feels not empty, but full. Crowded with memory, layered with old words spoken and forgotten. It is not the silence of fear, but of peace earned through remembrance. Perhaps that is what the Bell Witch truly became. Not a curse, not a warning, but a keeper of the echo, reminding us that even the quietest voice can shape a century. By the time the century turned, the Bell Witch had crossed the invisible border that separates history from folklore. What began as a family's private haunting had become a southern parable, retold in voices that shifted with each porch, each county, each passing generation. No longer bound to the Red River Valley, the story travelled through time, the way a melody travels through air, changed slightly by each singer, but never lost. At the dawn of the 20th century, the American South was a landscape still finding its voice after war and Reconstruction. Old stories of hauntings, miracles, and portents became a way to hold on to identity. The Bell Witch fit perfectly into that rhythm. She was mystery without menace, a ghost with more questions than cruelty. For the people of Tennessee, her tale was not simply entertainment. It was memory dressed in wonder. Writers began to arrive from Nashville and beyond, notebooks in hand, eager to capture the story as the older generations told it. They sat on porches with men who had heard their grandfathers swear to the truth of the voice, who claimed to have seen Lucy's Bible lift from her lap, or to have heard John Bell's name spoken in a whisper long after his death. Each retelling carried its own grain of truth, worn smooth by the passage of time. In 1934, a Nashville radio station broadcast The Haunting of the Bells, a dramatization based loosely on M.V. Ingram's book. It was performed live, with actors, sound effects, and the hollow echo of a church bell between scenes. Across the South, families gathered around their radios to listen. They said the air seemed different that night, still, charged, as if the voice itself might interrupt the broadcast. But no such thing occurred. Only silence followed the final words. And so, in the quiet fields of Tennessee, the Bell Witch waits. That broadcast marked a turning point. For the first time, the haunting had entered the nation's imagination, not as a rumor, but as art. From there it moved into magazines, plays, and traveling performances. By the 1940s, school children in Tennessee were reciting poems about Kate, the witch who could speak and sing. Church groups debated whether she was a demon or an angel misunderstood. The Bell Witch had become, in every sense, a mirror, reflecting whatever a listener most needed to believe. Scholars came next. Folklorists from universities began to treat the story as a cultural artifact. a southern myth of morality and consequence. They wrote that the Bell Witch embodied the tensions of the early frontier: faith and fear, family and fate, the human desire to name the unseen. Some traced her to earlier English legends, the Witch of Endor, or the talking spirit of Bodin. Others saw her as wholly American, born from the soil of the New World and the spiritual restlessness of its settlers. Yet despite all the study and speculation, the story refused to be pinned down. When interviewers asked locals for facts, they received feelings instead. "It was real," one old woman said, "but real doesn't always mean what you think it means." Her words, more than any historian's, captured the essence of the Bell Witch. A truth that lives not in evidence, but in atmosphere. Through the mid-20th century, the story continued to ripple outward. The cave near the Old Bell Farm became a modest tourist attraction. Hand-painted signs pointed down a dirt road where visitors could pay a small fee to walk through the cool stone corridors and listen to their own echoes. Guides told the story softly, their lanterns casting long shadows. Sometimes they would pause mid-sentence and let the silence speak for them. "Hear that?" they would whisper. "That's her, listening." For many visitors, that silence was the most haunting part. The air in the cave was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of earth and water. Drips fell from the ceiling in steady rhythm. Some claimed to hear a second drip, out of time with the first, as if something unseen were answering back. No one ever proved anything, of course, but that was never the point. The Bell Witch was not about proof. She was about presence. Outside the cave, the land itself seemed to breathe history. The river murmured through the reeds, the same sound John Bell would have heard when he first built his homestead. On warm evenings, mist rose from the fields, curling low over the ground like a memory reluctant to leave. The people of Adams learned to live with the story as one might live with weather, sometimes distant, sometimes near, always returning in its season. By the 1970s, the Bell Witch had entered classrooms and libraries. High school students wrote essays about the American ghost, exploring how belief could bind a community. Filmmakers came to Adams with cameras, interviewing descendants and exploring the cave. The documentaries spoke not of terror, but of tradition. The way a story, told long enough, becomes part of the soil that holds it. Even skeptics found themselves drawn in. "It's not about whether it happened," one journalist wrote, but that people kept needing it to have happened. The witch had become less a spectre than a symbol of endurance, of mystery, of the southern habit of finding poetry in the dark. In the decades that followed, the Bell Witch inspired plays, novels, and films. Each version reshaped her, sometimes as a curse, sometimes as protector of the land. The legend adapted the way rivers bend over time. Yet in Adams, Tennessee, the tone remained the same: quiet, respectful, half-believing. Even now, locals speak of her with a mixture of fondness and caution, lowering their voices slightly, as if not to disturb something ancient. The cave remains open to visitors. Tour guides still pause before entering, reminding guests to speak softly. Children laugh, flashlights dance along the walls, and somewhere, deep inside, water continues to fall in a steady rhythm older than any story. When the group leaves, the silence returns, deep and patient. The air cools again. The land exhales. Perhaps that is the truest form of haunting. Not fear, but continuity. The Bell Witch no longer needs to speak. Her story has become her voice, echoing through time, carried on lips that barely understand why they still whisper her name. And as the sun sets over Adams, painting the river gold and the trees bronze, you can almost feel her presence in the air, not as a threat, but as memory itself, soft and endless. The Bell Witch Cave lies low in the earth, tucked beneath a small rise just beyond the fields that once belonged to the Bell family. The entrance is narrow, half hidden behind the roots of old trees and the brush of river reeds. From the outside, it looks unremarkable, a quiet hollow in the Tennessee limestone. Yet those who step inside often pause at the threshold, struck by the feeling that they are crossing into a place where sound itself behaves differently. The air is cool, weighted with the scent of mineral water and ancient stone. Drips fall from the ceiling, slow and steady. The light fades quickly, swallowed by the curve of the tunnel, and in that half-dark, the mind begins to listen more deeply. Even the smallest sound, a shuffle of boots, a breath, a heartbeat, seems amplified, magnified by the silence that surrounds it. For more than a century, locals have said that this cave was the resting place of the Bell Witch. Some claim she retreated here after leaving the Bell home, choosing the earth as her dwelling. Others believe she had always been here, that the spirit who spoke to John Bell was as old as the limestone itself. Whether ghost or myth, the connection between the witch and the cave became inseparable, bound by the same soil and story. The earliest written accounts of the cave appeared in the 1850s, long after the Bell family's time. Travellers wrote of strange sounds, a woman's laugh, the tapping of unseen hands, whispers that seemed to follow them through the passageways. But those who lingered and listened closely often realized something simple. The cave's acoustics could turn one sound into many. A single drip could echo like footsteps. The breeze from the entrance could murmur like a sigh. And yet, even knowing that, many left the cave feeling that they had been in the presence of something aware. It wasn't terror they carried with them, but reverence, the sense that this quiet hollow remembered. In the early 1900s, families began to visit on Sundays after church, bringing children to hear the story firsthand. They would gather near the entrance, and an elder, usually a local farmer or schoolteacher, would tell the tale by a lantern light. The storyteller's voice would echo softly through the tunnel, each word bending into a second, ghostly version of itself. When the story ended, they would sit in silence, listening. Sometimes, someone would laugh nervously. Sometimes, no one spoke at all. By mid-century, the cave had become both a local landmark and a kind of open-air chapel of folklore. It drew not thrill-seekers, but listeners, people who wanted to feel close to the past, to hear how the land itself might remember what the living forget. The tours were humble affairs, a guide, a kerosene lamp, and a story passed down through generations. No special effects, no ghosts leaping from shadows, only voice and echo, woven together like two sides of the same breath. One guide, a man named James, gardener, led visitors through the cave for more than 30 years. He used to say, "The witch doesn't show herself to frighten folks. She just wants to be heard." When asked if he believed the story, he would smile and point to the ceiling. "You can hear her now if you listen right." Then he would tap the limestone with his hand, and the cave would answer with a low, soft tone, almost like a hum. Scientists who later studied the cave's acoustics found that its shape created perfect resonance in certain frequencies, especially those within the range of a human whisper. A voice spoken in the right place could seem to move, drifting through the tunnels as though alive. It was, perhaps, an explanation for the legend. But explanations do not erase meaning. They simply remind us that wonder has roots. Even today, the cave maintains its quiet reputation. Visitors describe a sense of calm rather than fear. Some bring offerings, small trinkets, wildflowers, handwritten notes, leaving them in crevices near the entrance. They say it feels right to give something back to the silence. At dusk, when the last tour ends and the lights are extinguished, the cave reclaims its natural soundscape. Crickets fade, the river hushes, and deep inside the earth, water continues its slow rhythm, patient as breathing. The darkness here is not oppressive, but deep and restful, like the closing of an old story. Folklorists often say that a legend survives not because it frightens, but because it comforts. The Bell Witch Cave offers that kind of comfort, the sense that history still lingers, that the land holds its own form of memory. Each visitor, in walking its cool corridors, becomes part of the echo, carrying the story forward in whispers, in retellings, in quiet belief. And perhaps that is what the Bell Witch desired all along. Not vengeance, not awe, but continuity. A voice kept alive through generations, long after her name was spoken for the last time. In the silence of the cave, she is no longer a spirit of anger, but of memory. On nights when the air outside is thick and the stars are hidden behind Tennessee clouds, the mouth of the cave glows faintly with fireflies. They hover near the entrance, their lights pulsing like slow heartbeats. To those passing by, it looks as though the earth itself is breathing. Some say it is the witch watching still. Others say it is only nature continuing its endless quiet song. Either way, it is beautiful. And so, the Bell Witch remains, not as a ghost, but as an echo that refuses to fade. Not as fear, but as folklore. Not as curse, but as connection. Night comes quietly to Adams, Tennessee. The fields where the Bell family once worked now lie open beneath a wide southern sky, silvered by moonlight and the slow breathing of the earth. The Red River moves with the patience of centuries, its water catching the faint shimmer of stars. Nothing stirs but the wind, whispering low through the grass. It carries no warning, no cry, only a hush that feels older than memory itself. This is where stories sleep, and sometimes wake again. The Bell Witch no longer belongs to one family, or even one place. She lives in the air of the valley, in the creak of the trees, in the slow rhythm of the river. Her voice, if she ever truly had one, is now a chorus made from the retellings of countless tongues. She has become what all legends eventually become, a bridge between what was lived and what is remembered. People still come. They arrive from distant towns, from far cities, from places where the Red River is only a name on a map. They walk the same dirt road that once led to John Bell's door, now softened by time and grass. They stop to listen, not for screams or curses, but for something gentler, a trace of the story's heartbeat. Some visitors bring children, telling the tale in soft tones as they walk. Others come alone, drawn by curiosity or nostalgia, or the faint hope that the silence might answer back. And sometimes, as the wind moves through the hollows, it does, though not in words and not in fear. It answers in the rustle of leaves, in the settling of dust, in the language of quiet things. Every ghost story, if told long enough, becomes a story about memory. The Bell Witch began as a haunting of one house, but over time, she became a haunting of history itself. She reminds us that the past never truly disappears. It simply changes form, whispering through generations until someone, somewhere, chooses to listen again. When folklorists study the legend, they look for patterns, the echoes of colonial superstition, the traces of frontier faith, the communal need to explain the unexplainable. But beyond the academic lines lies something softer, more human, the ache of remembering. The Bell Witch story endures not because it terrifies, but because it tenderly insists that voices once heard should not be forgotten. On some nights, if you stand by the riverbank, you can hear the water moving over the stones. Its rhythm is slow and constant, like the murmur of a long story told around an old fire. You might think of Lucy Bell then, sitting with her children in the candlelight, her Bible open on her lap. You might think of Betsy, grown older, her eyes bright with both belief and doubt. You might think of John, whose life ended in mystery and faith intertwined. And in that stillness, you might realize the haunting was never just theirs. It belongs to anyone who listens deeply to silence. The southern night deepens. Crickets pulse in the distance, their song weaving through the air like threads of an unseen loom. Somewhere, far off, a barn door creaks. The fields are silver now, soft under the moon, and the cave sleeps beneath them, holding the echo of every footstep that has passed through. Time folds gently here. Past and present blur like water and reflection. In the small town of Adams, people no longer fear the Bell Witch. They speak of her with affection, even gratitude. She is a kind of guardian now, a reminder that this quiet land once held voices brave enough to believe in the unseen. Each October, when the leaves turn to amber and the nights grow cool, locals gather to tell the story again. The children listen, wide-eyed, the elders smile. And when the tale ends, there is always a moment of silence, respectful, lingering, and full. Because deep down, they know what the legend has always been trying to say, that nothing truly vanishes if it is remembered with care. The Bell Witch's voice, whatever it once was, has become the hush of the Tennessee night, the shimmer of the Red River, the murmur of generations telling one another that there are things beyond reason, and that this is not a cause for fear, but for wonder. As you listen now, wherever you are, imagine the valley sleeping under its silver sky. Imagine the faint wind moving through the hollow, brushing the grass in slow patterns. Imagine that for a brief moment, all the world is as it was then, quiet, aware, alive with unseen presence. The story breathes, the silence listens back, and somewhere between the rustle of the trees and the steady rhythm of your own heart, you might hear what they heard so long ago. Not a voice of anger, but one of remembering. Not a curse, but a lullaby. A lullaby for a family, for a place, for the soft persistence of belief. A lullaby for the South, sung in whispers and echoes. A lullaby for the ghost that never truly left. The gold is gone, the people are gone, yet the silence remains, shining quietly beneath the southern sky.